Hi, this is Julie, and I'm going to demonstrate several things that we can do with while loops. So first I'm going to show you how we can either use copy and paste to print something multiple times or do the same code with a loop. I'm then going to use user input to decide how many times to execute a loop. I'm going to show you what an infinite loop looks like, how we can use a loop to print multiples of 5, and then finally how we can have a character variable, a char data type, and increment it so that we can print the alphabet. So I've begun this program. Up there are the comments of what I'm going to show you. Then I just have my basic environmental setup here. I began the main function, and I went ahead and created 3 variables for the things that I'm going to demonstrate here. I have 2 integer variables named count and total. And then I have a char data type named alpha, which I'll use with the last thing that I'm going to demonstrate. The first thing I want to do is show you how we can use a loop versus copy and paste. And so let's say I have a program here where I want to print hello on the screen 5 times. And I've gone ahead and typed the code to print it the first time. And it's just a basic cout statement with the string literal hello. And then I have embedded in it the \n escape sequence so that a carriage return is printed. And the next line will be the next text will be displayed on a new line on the screen. And so that's what I have to start with. So first, to print hello 5 times, if I don't know how to do loops, then I'm going to have to use copy and paste. And I can take this line of code here on line 18, and I can use a Control-C to copy it. Of course, there are multiple ways. You can also right-click and say copy, which also shows you the keyboard, shortcut Control-C, and some other things off of the menu. And I'm going to copy that into my clipboard, and I'm going to paste it 4 more times. No, not like that. Did not copy the return symbol. All right, so now I have 5 cout statements that print the word hello. And I can test this program and execute it, and I should see hello on my screen 5 times. And so this is the simple way to do it if I didn't know how to use loops. And when I execute the program, I'm going to see that indeed it printed hello 5 times, just as I expected. Now you should always look at your warnings, and I do see that I have 3 warnings in this program. And most warnings you need to fix, but in this case I have 3 unreferenced local variables, alpha, total, and count. And that's because I went ahead and created these variables, but I haven't used them yet, and it's warning me that I have some variables that I'm not using. Well, I'm about to use them, so that's okay. This is a warning that I can go ahead and ignore. I'm going to close this little output window just so my screen displays a little bit better. And I also see up here at the top that the word using on line 10 is underlined in red. And that usually indicates an error. It says that it expected a semicolon. This is probably a leftover error from something else. So this is a case where it's not really an error. And when I go and make other changes to this program, I expect to see that red line go away. If I had truly had a mistake where I had left out a semicolon, then this program would not have compiled and executed. So let's continue on, and then if we continue to see that, maybe we'll look at something else. All right, so we wanted to print hello 5 times, and we did, and that worked. And now I want to do the same code with a loop. I'm just going to put in a comment here to separate the sections of my code so that I know what the different parts of my program we're trying to do. And I'm also going to put a cout statement on the display because I'm going to use or do several different things here, and I want to be able to tell what's going on when I look at my display. I'm going to say cout print hello with a loop, something like that. All right. So in order to print this with a loop, there are several different types of loops in C++, but I'm going to demonstrate this with the while loop. And I'm going to need some sort of a test condition. Because I'm printing this 5 times, I'm doing it a set number of times, I need to be able to count how many times I'm executing this loop. And I'm going to use this variable count that I created at the top as my control variable. So I'm going to begin by initializing count. And that just means I'm going to give it a value before I start doing anything else. And I'll just put a little comment out to the side that I'm going to initialize it. Control variable. So here I have a statement that's just assigning count the value of 1 before I get started. Now I'm going to begin my while loop. And it begins with the reserved word while. And then I have to put a test expression inside the parentheses. What is the condition that I want to test for such that if this condition is true, I want to do the loop body. I want to execute the statements inside the loop body. Well, what we're doing here is we're wanting to execute this loop 5 times, so I just want to do a basic count operation. So I'm going to compare my count variable to the number 5. And as long as count is less than or equal to 5, then I want to execute the loop body. I'm going to put some opening and closing curly braces right here to surround my code block. And everything inside those curly braces are the lines of code I want to execute as long as count is less than or equal to 5. So I'm going to begin by putting in my cout statement to display the word hello. Then it's going to look exactly like it did before. Well, only if I type it that way. And \n. And that's going to display hello inside the loop body. I also need to increment my control variable by 1. I need to change the value of count so that I know that I have already executed that loop body 1 additional time. And now when I go test the value of count in the test condition, I can see if I want to execute the loop again. So let's say count equals count plus 1. And that is increment control variable. All right. So now what I have in this loop, on line 26, before the loop begins, I'm initializing the control variable to 1. Line 27 begins the actual while loop with a test expression of count less than or equal to 5 inside the parentheses. And then the loop body has statements on lines 28 and 29, where I'm going to display hello and change the value of count. So let's go ahead and test this program to see if this works. I'm going to use Control F5, or I could come up here to debug. I don't want to run this in debug mode today. I'm going to say start without debugging. Control F5. And now when I compile it, I still am getting warnings, but one less warning because the variable count is now being used. Go and close that little window there. And this is the output I get when I run the program. So I have the 5 hellos that I had with the copy and paste method. And then I have the 5 hellos that I got when I printed them inside the loop, in the while loop. So these 2 sets of code, lines 17 to 22 versus 24 to 30, are doing the same thing. It's just one is with the loop and one is without. So when I use this loop to print hello, the actual little lines of code that I'm using here are lines 26 to 30. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of code. The copy and paste method had lines 18 to 22 or 5 lines of code. I'm not really saving a lot of lines of code in this program at this point. Well, let's say I had wanted to print hello 50 times. I would have had to go up to line 18, copy that, and then paste it 45 more times in order to print it 50 times. Whereas in the loop, if I wanted to print hello 50 times, well, I could just come down here where the count is being compared to 5, could change that 5 to a 50, and rerun the program. And it's a little harder to tell what's going on because it scrolls off the screen, but I have a whole lot of hellos in here. So with the loop, it's much easier to modify how many times something's happening than with using copy and paste. And I'm going to change that back to a 5. I don't really want that scrolling off the screen. And another benefit that I have with the loop is, let's say we want to modify what's being displayed, and I want to include an exclamation mark just to make it a little more friendly. Up here on the copy and paste lines, I'm going to have to type an exclamation point 5 separate times. And if I'm not being careful, I may leave it off one of the times. Maybe not with just 5 output statements, but if I had something more complicated, I might not change it consistently. Down here in the loop, I'm going to put an exclamation mark on line 28, and that means I'm only having to modify a single line of code to get the exclamation mark on line 28. Well, let's go ahead and test this program. And now I'm seeing that I've added the exclamation point to lines 18 through 22. Each of those is displaying with an exclamation point. And now the one that's in the body of my loop, line 28, is also displaying with the exclamation point each of the 5 times. So now let's create a loop where we don't know how many times we want to execute it. We're going to ask the user how many times to execute the loop. I'm going to get rid of this output window here. And this time, I'm going to print the number 5, however many times the user wants to see it. So what I'm going to do here now is the second item on my list, I'm going to use user input to decide how many times to print the number 5. So for this, I'm going to use my second variable total. I'm going to ask the user for the value for total, and that will be what I compare count to. I'm just going to add this here to the bottom of the program. Input for printing 5s. All right. So I'm going to start by prompting the user for the value that I want. And I'm going to use a cout statement to tell them what I'm looking for. So there my cout statement is saying how many times should I print 5. Then I'm going to turn around and use a cin statement to get that value from the user for total. So with cout statement, I have operator pointing towards the output. With the cin statement, my operator points towards the variable because I'm going to get the value from the console window and put it in the variable total. Now let's put one little line of output just showing what we're about to do. Put a blank line in front of it, and I'm going to say 5s. Just to make my output a little easier to read, since we're doing several different things here. And now we're going to build our loop. And this is going to look a lot like the last loop looked like, where I'm going to initialize my control variable. I want to start the first count at 1. We used count a moment ago, and its value is no longer 1. So if I forget to change its value, I'm not going to get what I want here. We're going to begin by reinitializing it to 1. Then I'm going to create a while loop, and I'm going to compare count, this time to the value in the variable total. So I don't know how many times they want to print the number 5, so I don't want to compare count to 5. I want to compare it to the variable total. And then I'll have a body inside my while loop again where I print the number 5, and I'm going to once again increment my control variable count. So let's build that. If I were writing a real program, I would probably not add this many comments, but I'm doing this in a demonstration program just to make it obvious to you what I'm trying to do here. So that line of code was identical to what we did before. And my test condition will look very similar. I am using count again as my control variable, but this time I want to compare it to the value the user supplied in variable total. Now I'm inside the body of my while loop in the code block that's surrounded by the curly braces, and I'm going to begin by displaying the number 5. It's an integer literal, so it does not need any quotation marks, single or double or otherwise. And I could run them all together, but I think I will just separate them with a single character space. And I'll print each of them on the same line. So it'll just have a 5 space 5 whatever for however many times the user wants to display the 5. And then when I'm finished, because I don't have an end line or any kind of carriage return in here, I'm going to go ahead and print another end line at the end of my loop. So let's go ahead and test this program now. I'm down to one unreferenced local variable because I've now used count and total. And here is the program that looks very much like it did before, but now I'm getting the prompt asking me how many times should I print 5. So I'm going to print it just 3 times. And what I'm going to see here now is an infinite loop. And this program is going to print 5 basically forever until I either kill this process or turn off the computer. So I'm going to kill this, and whenever you have an infinite loop like this that you didn't want, you can kill it with a Control-C. Let's do that, even though it does look kind of pretty. And I can also see that my program executed with this very strange code instead of 0 because I forced it to terminate. Let's go ahead and close that window and take a look at why do we have an infinite loop. So let's compare the loop beginning on line 27 with the loop beginning on line 37. And the first difference is we're comparing count to an integer literal versus a variable. That's really nothing to do with this. The next line is displaying the output. That seems to be working. But on line 29, I'm incrementing the control variable in that loop, but the second loop does not ever increment the control variable. And so there's nothing inside of this loop to ever modify the variable count. And that means count is going to continue to have the value of 1. This test expression here, count less than or equal to total, will always be true, and this program will continue to display 5 over and over. So we have to have a statement in this while loop to increment or modify this control variable or something in order to eventually make this test expression evaluate to false. I'm going to put in that same line of code that we had in the other loop, because I'm using the same variable. And I'm going to increment count by 1. And there's really a shorter way to do that, same statement, that we'll be looking at very soon. So I've added line 39 to this code. Let's see if it runs any better. I'm once again going to try to print 5 3 times. And this time, that loop executes exactly 3 times. I'm going to uncover this, getting rid of this little box here so we can see it and compare it to our output. And this time when I ran the program, I entered a 3 for total. I compared count to total. But I incremented count each time that I executed the loop. I don't know why that's jumping around like that for me. And so now this loop only executed 3 times, and that's what I'm looking for. All right, so I'm going to add one other little comment here, omit for, actually I'm just going to replace, we already know that's increment control variable. I'm going to say omit for infinite loop. I don't want to keep an infinite loop in this program because I want to do some other things with it. But I do want to at least have a comment in here indicating the importance of this line. Now this program is not validating the user input. And so when I run this program, I can put in some crazy values here. For example, I can say that I want to execute this program -2 times, or print it -2 times. And that really doesn't make any sense. And what happens is I don't get any 5s at all. Let's look at what's really happening in this program. I come down here, let's move this up a little there. I come into this program, or I'm rather into the while loop. Total has a value of -2. Count has a value of 1. And I'm only going to execute this loop if count is less than or equal to total. Well, 1 will never be less than or equal to -2, so the test condition is never true, and I'm not going to execute the body of this loop at all. So what we've done so far are a couple of simple loops. The first loop, we had a fixed number in here. We wanted to execute it exactly 5 times. We printed hello 5 times. The second loop used the user input to decide how many times to execute the loop. But this time, what I'm going to do is make a loop that's a little bit more complicated, and I want to print multiples of 5. So I'm going to make the body of my loop a little more complicated. I'm going to use that count variable to determine what value to display. So I'm going to go ahead and put in here another comment that I'm now going to print multiples of 5. Let's see if we can get this a little higher on the screen here. All right, I want to keep that loop. And I'm going to do it in a similar way to the previous loop. I'm going to go ahead and reuse that value total that the user supplied. I'm still going to continue to use count as my control variable. But this time, when I display 5, I want the value of 5 to change every time. And I could create another variable to do this, but I'm going to do it another way that's even simpler. So let's first put another comment out on the screen about what we're printing. I'm going to put a return character before my comment here, and then I'm going to say that I'm printing multiples of 5. All right, so that's not really part of the loop, but now let's build the loop, and I need to reinitialize that control variable again, back to 1. I'm not going to put a comment this time. I think we have already done that enough. And I need my while loop test condition is going to look exactly the same as it did before. I want to execute this loop as long as count is less than or equal to total, or basically however many times the user asks me to print it. But this time, instead of displaying the value of 5, I want to multiply 5 by count. And so what this is going to do, the first time this loop executes, count is going to have a value of 1, and I'll display 5. Then we're going to increment count. Count will become 2. We'll execute the loop again, the body of the loop. Count is 2, so I'm going to multiply 5 by 2. And I'm going to now see the value of 10. And this is going to continue to happen over and over until I print it as many times as the user asks me to display it. So let's wrap this up again with another end line, since we don't have any end lines inside that loop body. And what I can see here is that these two loops are identical, except the second loop on line 47 is multiplying the control variable by the constant 5. Let's execute that and see what happens here. Okay, and to make this a little more interesting this time, I'm not going to just print 3 of them. Let's print 5 10 times. So in the first loop where I'm printing the 5s, I can see that there are 10 5s displayed on the screen. under the word fives. So right here I have 5, 5, 5, 5, 5 for a total of 10 times. But then on the multiples of 5, I have taken that 5 and I have multiplied it by the variable count. And that's going to show me the first 10 multiples of 5. And so with this loop here, I'm using my control variable not only to manage how many times should I execute the loop, but I'm also using it to modify the output. So let's take a look at our list of tasks here. We used copy and paste versus a loop. We used user input to get a value for how many times to execute the loop. We looked at what an infinite loop looks like. And then we used the user input to decide how many multiples of 5 to display on the screen. The last thing I want to show you is how I can print the alphabet using a while loop. And I'm going to use this char data type here, my variable called alpha, to do this. This is going to be a loop where we're not working with an integer number this time. I'm actually going to be looking at my char values. I'm going to go to the bottom of the program and I'm going to add another comment here that we're going to now demonstrate incrementing char variables. And let's go ahead and put another line out of my output. And I'm going to display the alphabet. All right, so in all the previous loops so far, I have been using count as my control variable. I initialized it to 1, and then I continued to increment it until it was larger than the total number of executions. This loop's going to look a little different. Instead of count, this time I'm going to use alpha. And I'm going to initialize alpha to the char value of A. Now remember, when you're working with char data types, we can't set the value to a string literal with double quotes. I have to use single quotes, and if I were to put double quotes on here, I wouldn't get what I want to see. In fact, Visual Studio has already flagged this as an error with this line here, and it says that I can't assign a value of type const char star to an entity of type char. And that might be a confusing message for you. But when we're working with string literals, this goes back to the C language, not the C++ string class. But a string literal in double quotes is actually a data type of char star. And that's why we see that in the message. And so it's not so important that you understand the message, but that you understand, hey, there's a problem here and you need to fix it. It is a char data type, and char data types are assigned a value in single quotes for a single character value. So that's initializing my control variable. And now I'm going to start building my while loop. So again, it begins with while. And it's going to be followed by my test expression and then my loop body. So for this loop, the test expression is going to be a little bit different. I want to print the alphabet all the way from A to Z. Now right now, alpha's value is capital A. I want to execute this loop as long as alpha has a value somewhere between A and Z. So I'm going to compare alpha to the character capital Z. And then inside my loop body, I'm going to display that alpha value, the char data type, or the char value for the char variable. And then I'm going to increment it. And I'm going to follow this up with an end line. So, how on earth does this work? Well, you remember our char data type is actually stored as an integer from the ASCII table. And so capital A has an ASCII value of 65, and capital B is 66, and so forth and so on, all the way up to Z. And because we're actually storing an integer value inside the character, we can add 1 to the integer value, and that's just going to set it to the next character in the ASCII table. So let's go ahead and test this program. I'm still going to be asked that question about how many times I want to print the number 5. Well, let's just do a bigger one this time for fun. 15. That gets me all the way up to the value of 75. Well, what I'm really wanting to look at here is my alphabet. And I can see now there is capital A, and this goes all the way through capital Z, and then nothing else. So, looking at this here, alpha is a char data type. I'm giving it the starting value of capital A. Then I'm going to increment it so that its next value is capital B. And this is going to happen so on and so forth until we get a value that's greater than what capital Z is. So I don't recall what capital Z's ASCII value is, but that's just a matter of going to the ASCII table and we can look at that. And so here is an excerpt from an ASCII table from the Wikipedia site. And what we have here is the decimal value is the turquoise column, the second column here. And what we began with was a decimal value of 65. That was a capital A. We continued to increment this until the alpha's value became a 91, which would then set it to the opening square bracket. I could have also set this up where I had initialized it to lowercase a and then made my test expression compare it to lowercase z, and that would work exactly the same. So that's how you can use character data types in a while loop in order to print the alphabet.